So, this is the background to Heaney's poem, The Tollund Man, um, which was based on the discovery of two bodies in the bogs of Denmark. The police I'm going to try and pronounce these names. I've consulted my Scandinavian helpers, but I'm pretty sure that I'll still butcher them in the same way that I usually do. The police in Silkeborg, I'm pretty sure I've messed that up, received an alarming message. On the previous Saturday, a body had been discovered in a bog close to Bjeldskovdale, I'm told. It's something along these lines, 10 miles to the south. Eventually, it was discovered that these bodies were preserved corpses of men from the first part of the Iron Age, 300 to 400 BC, so nearly 2,500 years old. And the body is discovered with a rope around his neck. And people were asking if it had been used for hanging or strangling, and if the body was a sacrificial killing, or if it was guilty for a crime, or a slave, or perhaps a well-to-do man sacrificed to appease the gods of the bog. So these are the questions that are being asked at the time. A Danish anthropologist, P.V. Glob, wrote a book called The Bog People about the ritualistic killings that had formed the basis for the rituals that these bodies had been killed as part of. And it showed the photos of these bodies being removed from the bog. And Heaney was fascinated by this book and saw the removal of these bodies as an image of rebirth. And he's quoted as saying this about the Tollund Man. I'm sure it's probably Tollund Man or something like that. He seemed like an ancestor almost, one of my old uncles, one of those mustached archaic faces you used to meet all over the Irish countryside. There's I think, a sense of kind of Nordic connection between the ethnicity of the Irish and the Scandinavian, the Norse people. And Heaney saw an analogy between the sacrificial murder of these bodies and the victims of Irish political violence during the Troubles. So the Tollund Man is a confrontation with the Troubles, the sectarian political violence that spanned and exploded in the late 1960s and went all the way up to the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. And the poem has been seen as an attempt to create this continuity in terms of time between the historical past and the political present of the poem. And Michael Parker argues that he articulates a perception not only of the pastness of the past, but its presence, a sense of the timeless as well as the temporal, and of the timeless and temporal together. So if this really interesting handling of time here is if there is a sort of cyclical coherence between these pagan sacrificial murders and the sacrificial murders that are being carried out in the name of the Troubles. So one of the things to bear in mind is that the Norse mythology surrounding this pagan mythology, surrounding these murders is a female kind of nature goddess called Nerthus, who required the sacrifice of a male body in order to guarantee fertility in the seasons. So one person was murdered as a sacrificial offering in order to guarantee the fertility of the land and a good harvest and a good crop. And that's where it's believed that this body comes from. So you'll see in that pagan belief an equation of the mindless slaughter of the contemporary political present of the poem in the Troubles with the mindless sort of heretical, pre-Christian primitive belief system. I think Heaney's equating that, very, very powerfully. I think that the sort of the heretical and anti-religious nature of the murders, which are based around sectarian religious conflict. So he's making a really powerful point here about the delusions that those carrying out these acts of violence in the name of religion were guilty I think, are sort of suffering and labouring under these illusions of it being about religion. And he deliberately equates this sacrificial primitive murder from pre-Christian Europe to the troubles which are going on in the name of sectarian conflict between facets of Christianity. So it opens with an allusion to the Catholic tradition of pilgrimage to the preserved bodies of saints. And it suggests that Heaney's identifying a kind of spiritual consolation in this body as a consolation for the troubles. He says, someday I will go to Aarhus, the town in Denmark where the body is contained in a museum, to see his peat brown head. So the imagery that describes the body emphasizes the organic connection between it and its surroundings. Its head takes on the peat brown colour of the bog itself. It also hints at the natural motivations for his sacrifice. He's sacrificed in the name of nature and fertility. And that continues here. The mild pods of his eyelids, his pointed skin cap. And that metaphor here of his eyes like mild pods renders them as part of this sort of organic image, and also implies the motivation for pagan sacrifice of fertility and of the sort of fecundity of the harvest that motivates the pagan sacrifice to the goddess Nerthus. This assonantal echo of will, see, Pete in those three words in the opening couplet, I think they contribute to this aestheticization of his body. So the isolated anatomical imagery of his parts of his body, his peat brown head, the mild pods of his eyelids, his pointed skin cap, functions, I think, almost as if the speaker is experiencing unfolding ekphrasis, the comprehension phenomenologically of a work of art. And when you look at the body, it does really look like a sculpture. So I think Heaney is attempting to sanctify this body by virtue of its aesthetic appearance, but also by virtue of the sense of timelessness of the suffering that is contemporaneously occurring in the Troubles. There's a sort of consolation in that timelessness and a tragedy as well. In the flat country nearby where they dug him out, his last gruel of winter seeds caked in his stomach, I think that assonance that dug him out emphasizes almost a sense of internal rhyme that suggests the same sense of internal protection that the seeds in his stomach are receiving, as if it's encapsulating the line itself and it's encapsulating the seeds, and makes it seem like the body is sort of designed to bring about this fertility ritual that the sacrifice is designed to engineer. They dug him out gruel. In each of those words, those sort of assonantal U and O sounds give you that sense of internal encapsulation. His last gruel of winter seeds, that gruel of winter seeds there, and that imagery reveals that the sparing meal that became his last is caked in his stomach. And there's something kind of ironic about this, that a gruel, something very primitive and coarse in terms of food, becomes like a cake, something sweet and rich in his stomach. And I think that last gruel of seeds becomes a symbol of regeneration and renewal, and suggests the motives for this pagan sacrifice. And it's a primitive belief that Heaney that is implicitly connecting to the Troubles. As if this highly primitive, inaccurate understanding of the nature of regeneration in the natural world is completely wide of the mark. But that belief that justified this murder is just as wide of the mark as the religious justifications that are being used during sectarian conflict to explain why there's a sort of moral force behind killing people who are innocent. He's naked except for the cap. That naked and caked, a sort of assonantal echo across the stanzas, caked and naked, connects stanza to stanza. and I think emphasizes this unfolding comprehension of the body and its significance. You see that in the powerfully enjambed lines, all the way down to line 7 in the poem, naked except for the cap, noose, and girdle, I will stand a long time. The cap, noose, and girdle in this list, I think, reveals the downward trajectory of the speaker's vision as he looks at his head, then the noose that's strangled him, and then the girdle around his waist. And the objects, I think, metonymically represent his sacrificial suffering. The noose itself embodies the theme of sacrificial murder that this poem is about. That long sentence ends with this confessional statement, I will stand a long time. And there's an ambiguity about this, that he will stand maybe politically a long time for peace or whichever belief system that he appears to be advocating, which is, I think, a sort of reconciliation between these sectarian factions. But then that long sentence, if you read it, in the flat country nearby where they dug him out, his last gruel of winter seeds caked in his stomach, naked except for the cap, noose, and girdle, I will stand a long time. I think there's an acknowledgement of the difficulty of the subject and the patience that is required in order to accurately comprehend the significance of something like this, to identify the figurative and spiritual consolation that Heaney's seeking in this experience. It will take a long time of standing in order to formulate that sense. That's what this poem, I think, seeks to carry out. Bridegroom to the goddess, and this is where this extended metaphor representing the body's relationship with the bog as a kind of romantic or sexual one, as this man becomes the bridegroom to this goddess Nerthus, who demands a male sacrifice to procreate and guarantee the germination of the crop. Bridegroom to the goddess, she tightened her talk on him and opened her fen. So there is this suggestion here of the noose, the braided necklace that is around the body's neck as a torque, which is this sort of ornamental jewellery. And it's this thing that strangled the man, but it's also, I think, suggestive of sexual interaction, that she tightens her sort of body around him and opens herself up, opens her fen up to him. Fen is obviously the land of the bog, which absorbs this body. But it becomes sexualized to fit with this ritualistic narrative, as if the fen is absorbing him and purifying him through this assimilation, through this absorption of the body. And those dark juices working him to a saint's kept body. So these dark juices, it connects to the scientific process of preservation that actually occurs in bodies like this and allows them to survive, 2,400 years of degradation. It's personifying these waters of the bog, which are actually acidic. And it suggests that they're working him to a saint's kept body, that they're sublimating this corpse to a sense of embodied spirituality, as it provides some form of historical consolation. That's the reason why it seems saintly, is that it provides consolation in the sense of other eras and other experiences like this having taken place. And in the act of doing that preservation, it canonizes this corpse and turns it holy, which is itself quite a heretical point to make in, Orthodox, Catholic, and Christian terms. Those dark juices in working him to a saint's kept body, trove of the turf cutter's honeycombed workings. So the body itself is a trove, a treasure trove. And that lexical choice reveals that sense of veneration and respect again. But it's of the turf cutter's honeycombed workings, and the dental alliteration of the trove turf cutters suggests the sound of digging and of the delicate work of the archaeologists who dug this body up. and their honeycombed workings, depicting through imagery the beauty of this quite humble work of digging through the soil. The word workings here, of taking this dynamic, fluid verb and turning it into a noun, is that device anthemeria once more. And I think it's perhaps mirroring of the fluidity of truth in this poem, that it requires working through, and that's what I think the poem is seeking to do. It's sort of working out the way in which this can be seen in terms of spiritual consolation. It says, now his stained face reposes at Aarhus. And that imagery suggests, I think, the sense of moral corruption involved in perhaps the removal of the body from the bog itself, and its aestheticization, as if it's stained like stained glass, or it's stained with a sense of moral taint. Then we have the second section. I could risk blasphemy. And the blasphemy here is by treating the pagan sacrifice as something sacred, as it, and by doing so being blasphemous and almost heretical. And that conditional tense, I think, shows the speaker's cautiousness around the decision to connect history with the current political context, and that it's a sense of unresolved tension and unresolved affiliation that the poem, I think, is trying to work through, of asking the body to reveal the secrets of current sectarian conflict. I could risk blasphemy by consecrating the cauldron bog, our holy ground, and pray him to make germinate. So consecrating the cauldron bog, is making this sort of dirty land in some ways holy and sacrosanct. There's really something interesting going on the level of lexical choice here, where you have this Latinate language of consecration that is so deeply associated with the tradition of Catholicism and the Roman Church, and then this Gaelic word bog, of connecting those two words on the level of etymology, I think dignifies the process that could happen by suggesting that this cauldron bog can be sanctified in some way. And I think the cauldron image also connotes that sense of occultist mysticism and magic, which is also seen as heretical. Consecrating this as our holy ground, and pray him to make germinate the scattered ambushed flesh of labourers. So there's a suggestion here of almost summoning this body to bring those people who have been murdered in the political reprisals of the Troubles, of asking this body to make their bodies germinate, to bring them back almost in a form of rebirth. The syntax of this phrase, consecrate the holy bog and our holy ground, and pray him to make germinate. And there's a shift here of the verb germinate into an adjective, shifting action into a state of existence, as if we're going to sort of germinatify, we're going to bring about the germination of these scattered, ambushed bodies, these disembodied bits of flesh and corpses. So the syntax, I think, puts heavy emphasis on this final word that concludes the stanza, and asks us to bring about this state, ask the body almost, or could suggest the possibility of asking the body to bring about the germination, the rebirth of these grotesquely dismembered bodies that are described in the next stanza. The lexical choice here, the scattered, ambushed flesh of labourers. This image is really terrifying. We have these adjectives in the lexical choice, scattered and ambush. First of all, suggests seeds inside the corpse and develops this extended metaphor of the past offering explanation of the present, as if the bodies of those killed in the Troubles are those scattered seeds inside the bog body's stomach. But then ambushed shifts us into the present and the context of the Troubles. So we ask then, who is ambushed? There's an ambiguity here. If the discoverer is ambushed by revelation or the bodies themselves in death, this alludes to farm workers killed in a 1920s black and tan reprisal, civilians who were murdered as part of the sectarian conflict. And that synecdoche, the scattered, ambushed flesh of labourers, dehumanises these farm workers and makes them seem not much more than a few measly, caked seeds in the stomach of a bog body. They are dehumanized and reduced down to that sense of component pieces. The stockinged corpses laid out in the farmyards, that very deliberate suggestion of civilian clothing and rural labour that are laid out in farmyards. These are not military people. Heaney goes to lengths to make sure that we're aware of the civilian sacrifices here that are being carried out in the name of sectarian conflict. And also this connects in this imagery of the stockinged corpses in the farmyards to his own family heritage. And so the pointlessness of those civilian sacrifices seems to cohere in some way with the primitive ritualistic murder in pre-Christian pagan belief systems. And then he develops this sense of faceless, gruesome violence as it's laid out in the farmyards, telltale skin and teeth flecking the sleepers of 4 young brothers trailed for miles along the lines. Now these bits of skin and teeth here gruesomely alludes to a folkloric tale of 4 brothers being mutilated by being dragged behind a train along the tracks. But those skin and teeth tell a tale. The skin and teeth synecdochically represent the components of this pointless sacrifice, and that this tale of needless suffering is being connected to the past. And the consolation that's being located in this is that this is some timeless theme of human civilization. But within that consolation is also a sense of tragedy, as if we haven't yet worked out how to stop pointlessly murdering each other for reasons that don't hold up to logic. The telltale skin and teeth, that grim hint there of the actual subject of this, the teeth through dental alliteration, is quite horrifying, I think. And flecking the sleepers, again, that antimiri is used, where flecks are little fragments of something but are turned into this verb here, suggests, I think, a parallel between these little fragments and the seeds inside the bog body, as if they're flecking the soil like seeds. And it's 4 young brothers trailed for miles along the lines. And this iambic syllabic pattern in these final lines contrasts with the multiple stresses in that previous line, telltale skin and teeth, of 4 young brothers trailed for miles along the lines. And that iambic rhythm in that final line gruesomely recreates the sound of the train coming along the tracks. And then we move into the reflective third section of this poem. Something of his sad freedom as he rode the tumbril should come to me, driving, saying the names, Tollund, Rawala, Nabelgard, watching the pointing hands of country people not knowing their tongue. Now, this opening line is sad freedom, describes through oxymoronic terms the victim's openness to the elements in the car and his predetermined fate. So there's something illogical about this. The tumbril is the guillotine cart that was used in the French Revolution. And again, the choice of that word echoes the sort of cyclical patterns of history and the sacrificial violence that seems to be one of its timeless themes. And that sad freedom is highlighted in his location in this, the freedom being open to the elements and the sadness that actually that freedom of being open to the elements is a sign of anything but, the lack of freedom in his loss of life that's about to take place. Should come to me. So the conditional sense here through this modal verb should suggests the speaker's hope for what he calls the redress of poetry, as if poetry, through its identification of universal themes, offers some kind of consolation for the suffering that is being experienced in the present. Something of his sad freedom should come to me. Driving, saying the names, as if repeating these names functions like an incantation, and perhaps almost prayer-like, that he suggests as a possibility in the opening to the second section here. I could risk blasphemy by consecrating the holy bog, as if what he's doing here is that sacred prayer. It should come to me, saying the names, Tollund, and Nebelgard, and these are the locations in Denmark where each of these bog bodies were dug up. But there are also a very gentle allusion to Yeats's Easter 1916, which is a poem about Irish Republican Revolution. It ends with that refrain, all is changed, change utterly, a terrible beauty is born. And so there's this sense in that poem that nothing would ever be the same again. And yet here's the grim irony of this, is that everything is still the same. The same as 2,500 years ago. The repeated, inevitable nature of the cycles of history and its sacrificial violence, its pointless murders. Watching the pointing hands of country people not knowing their tongue. So he talks here obviously of describing him driving through this countryside and being directed by people who are from this part of Denmark. But again, uses synecdoche, the pointing hands of these people, which disembodies them and I think reveals his own sense of alienation from them at this moment in time. But it's of country people. And so there's something of them that he identifies with, because this is a sector of the population that his own heritage sort of resides within, but doesn't know their tongue. So again, he's alienated on a linguistic level, which is ambiguous because people themselves can't speak, as if they're in trauma or mourning. We're not sure whether it's him that doesn't know their tongue or if it's the people he's looking at that can't speak, which gives this just a sense of the connotation of trauma and mourning. Out here in Jutland, in the old man-killing parishes, I will feel lost, unhappy, and at home. So, in this final stanza, we have all of that emotional complexity carried out in this declaration. So the parish, I think, metonymically represents the church, connecting historical with current context, the man-killing parishes. But it personifies them too as aggressive and evil. And it should, in theological terms, be a paradox, that something can't be man-killing and a parish at the same time. It can't claim for itself a religious designation and then be a place where sacrificial murder takes place. They should be mutually exclusive. And that construction captures all of that uncertainty and emotional turmoil that Heaney locates in this body, seeing within it the possibility of the redress of poetry, the consolation of universal suffering, that other people have been through it too, and yet the tragedy that other people have been through it too, and we haven't stopped doing this to each other. And this extraordinarily understated conclusion that captures that sense of tragic admixture of identification with atrocity, that brings consolation but also brings a deep sense of melancholy and tragedy. I will feel lost because it's strange, unhappy because of the grim realization of the cyclical nature of violence, and yet at home it will in some way allow me to identify that what we seem to be living through in the context of the Troubles in Ireland is something that other people throughout the past have also experienced themselves. So we have that wonderful understated conclusion that captures all of that ambivalence and emotional complexity that Heaney expertly captures in the representation of his experience of perceiving this body. It isn't just pure description of the body itself, it's what this perception of this body functions as almost as a springboard for this attempted spiritual constellation that he seeks to articulate in the text.